I want to welcome everyone tonight to what is the second in our spring program series. I think it's the second, yeah. We have 3 more, so some of them are sold out, but I think there are still some openings at the Shepherd's department store event on Monday evening, so please check our website if you're interested in attending that. It's a fascinating story of adaptive reuse and innovative solution for a very important landmark in our community. But I want to welcome everyone to the Cathedral of St. John, or to the library of the Cathedral of St. John, and really want to thank the Episcopal Diocese of Rhode Island, their staff and clergy for hosting us and having us all here tonight. It is quite a complex of important buildings, and as you can see, they do need some work. But as I told the bishop just a few minutes ago, this reminds me very much of the brick schoolhouse, which is under the ownership of the Preservation Society. So we're not throwing stones at people who can't maintain their buildings to the highest degree. But we're here tonight to learn about a plan that could help the building be restored to its former glory. The reason we're here tonight partially came out of the fact that we are celebrating 20 years of our Most Endangered Properties program. Since 1994, we've been listing 10 properties a year to help us focus on coming up with solutions for places that we just feel are too valuable for our community to lose. We have lost some, but most of them are still with us. And this spring, we're looking at some things like, as I mentioned, Shepherd's Department Store. We have a North Burial Ground tour this Saturday. No, not this Saturday, but we have one coming up, North Burial Ground. This Saturday, we have a micro-living tour showcasing 2 properties, the Arcade and the George C. Arnold building, and how they're being reused for micro-living in downtown Providence. And the Cathedral of St. John, this complex, has been included on our endangered list for 7 years, from 2007 to 2014. And in 2012, the cathedral closed to regular services. Late last year, I think in November, probably everyone here saw a story in the Providence Journal about plans for the creation of the nation's first museum on the transatlantic slave trade and Center for Reconciliation, using the cathedral as the place for those. Tonight, we have the honor of bringing to the public a conversation that includes both the historical context and more information on how plans for the cathedral's use fits into this context. So the format for the evening is as follows. Our first speaker, Professor Anthony Bogues, will introduce us to the Rhode Island's involvement in the international slave trade. And then Bishop Knisely will elaborate on the goals and objectives that he has for the museum and the Center for Reconciliation. And then we will conclude the evening with a short panel discussion and a question and answer period. We have allotted about an hour for this program. I imagine we'll go a little bit later, but we want to get some people out as they have other engagements this evening. So let us get started. Professor Anthony Bogues is a writer, scholar, curator, and the director of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. He teaches courses on Africana political philosophy, cultural politics, intellectual history, and contemporary critical theory and comparative literature of Africa and the African diaspora, as well as courses on the history of Haitian society and art. In 1994, he received his PhD in political theory from University of West Indies, and at this time, I would like to welcome Professor Anthony Bogues to the podium for his remarks.
Thank you very, very much. I want to begin by thanking the Providence Preservation Society for putting on this particular event. I think it's an important event in Providence, and my hope is that we can begin a set of conversations about the Center for Reconciliation as well as about the proposed museum. In my brief remarks, I'm going to make a set of general statements, partly to provoke discussion, but also in part to present a point of view about slavery which we do not often take into consideration. The still overarching historical view of slavery in America is that it was not only a peculiar institution, but that it was a southern war. That the country was divided into north and south, and then went to war with the north, went to war with the south, and that in that war, slaves were emancipated after the south lost. It is a smooth narrative, simplistic in its elegance, but fraught with illusions and omissions, and therefore does not confront the history of the country. It is difficult sometimes to talk about slavery, to have a conversation about slavery, because not only of this smooth narrative, but also to talk about slavery is to confront something which we tend to elide in this country, and that's a conversation on racism. So I want to make my first general sweeping statement, that slavery in America quickly became, by the end of the century, and certainly by the 18th century, racial slavery, not just chattel slavery. And that as racial slavery, it was a system of slavery based upon race. And it is, I think, important to understand that one of the distinctive marks of slavery in this country, and as well as in the Americas, was how the black skin became synonymous with that of being a slave. Thomas Jefferson, our president, one of our first presidents, noted in his book, Notes on Virginia, and this is what he says. He says, the problem with slavery in America is that it's identified with a skin of somebody, unlike slavery in the Roman Empire. And then he goes on to say, that problem means it's difficult to deal with it. So that the question, therefore, of the black skin and therefore of racism becomes central to this business of slavery, and therefore should be central to anything about reconciliation. The general point, therefore, I'm making is that we are not speaking about reconciliation only because of slavery. That in Rhode Island, that there were over 106,000 slaves that were carried over in 934 slaving voyages that were done by Rhode Island merchants between 1907 and 1807, after the colony was formed in 1635. Or the fact that in the late 18th century, after the American Revolution, Rhode Island merchants controlled over 70% of the American trade in slaves. What we are talking about, I think, is that in addition to slavery, is that anti-black racism became an essential ingredient of the system of slavery. What is, I think, important to note in trying to think about Rhode Island are the following things. One, that the way in which slavery developed in Rhode Island was also layered upon a previous system of slavery that existed among the indigenous population, the Native American, Pequot and Narragansett. And that one, you can't think about slavery if you don't also think about the colonial wars, from the Pequot War to the Roger Williams, to the King Philip's War, and the ways in which prisoners of wars were taken and then turned into slaves. So that what you have, I think, in the Rhode Island case, which is very important, is that you really had a system of slavery in which was practiced in the 1600s and was practiced in many other places, not just the United States, where prisoners of wars were captured and turned into slaves. But then quickly you had layered upon that the introduction of African slavery. And therefore, that layering of African slavery, I think, becomes very important in trying to think about the two social groups in this state, but also very importantly, in trying to think about this question of reconciliation. When it comes to this business of what was Rhode Island, it is very true to say that Rhode Island was actually the epicenter of slavery in the North and in New England. That after Boston fell away, as things happened, then Bristol and Newport became the most important ports for the transportations of slaves, African slaves. By 1708, in this state, slaves outnumbered white indentured servers 8-1. In 1708, 5% of the population in Rhode Island were African slaves. By 1755, 50 years after, 11% were of African descent. In places like Narragansett County, what we call South County, planters had huge plantations, sometimes 4 miles long or 12,000 acres, in which they actually had slaves working working on those plantations. So there's a way in which Rhode Island has a certain history to it, which we need to think about. In other words, there's one way in which we think some places were just doing finances and so on. In this particular state, people were actually practicing had slave labor, both in domestic sense and all domestic ways, as well as working on some kind of plantations. It is interesting or important to note that the African slave trade transported 12 million Africans to the Americas, of which 600,000 came to the United States, and therefore led to the creation of an African-American community. It is important to understand that Rhode Island after the 1750s had up to 20 voyages per year leaving Newport to go to deal with the transport of African slaves. And what is fascinating, I think, in thinking about the history of this place is perhaps to go back to the 1647 General Assembly. And the first General Assembly in Rhode Island essentially adopted the seal of the Rhode Island state as the anchor. And that's important, the ship's anchor, because what that meant is that, therefore, how was wealth going to be generated? We just finished a winter, right? That many of us would like to forget, right? So how was wealth going to be generated in this place? And wealth, if you were by the sea and you were involved in the slave trade as an international business, then obviously you then begin to think that ships, then you can then transport people from Africa here and then into the Caribbean. And what is therefore to think about Rhode Island as the epicenter in the north is to think about Rhode Island not so much as carrying slaves to plantations, but to think about Rhode Island, that happened, but to think about Rhode Island doing ships from Bristol and Newport to the west coast of Africa, carrying back African slaves here, then picking up rum. There were something like 24 distilleries in Bristol in 1700. Then picking up rum, carrying back the slaves to Africa, to the Caribbean, and selling it. So that there was a certain triangular trade, and that triangular trade involved the western coast of Africa, the Caribbean, and part of Rhode Island. And what is interesting, something I didn't know when I come from the Caribbean until I arrived here, was that in fact some of the best Caribbean rum was not made in the Caribbean, but was actually distilled from the sugar molasses in the Caribbean, was actually distilled in this place. What that means is that everybody was implicated, not just those persons and the captains on the ships. That really they had the suppliers of the goods. You have horses that were sent to the Caribbean, that were slave colonies, hay, beef, timber, the making of the ships. I mean, every single person who was working, because this was an important business, this was the #1 business in the state, everybody was involved in some kind of way. And therefore it meant that this was not a marginal activity. So that when we reframe the smooth narrative of the South, when we think about questions about black racism as central to the ideology of the social system, and when we think about the role, as I briefly described, that Rhode Island has played, then we have to think about the question of history and the present. History, I would want to suggest to you, leaves what I like to call sedimented deposits. That is, people make history. And they make history by creating and constituting ways of life, customs, norms, and ways of thinking. We like to call these legacies, but sometimes I think legacies is too weak a word. Right? Legacies can either be this or it can either be that. But I think if you think about the ways in which history operates since we create history, and how history making actually creates customs, institutions, ways of life, and that these are actually deposits that are left there, which then shape how we think and reframe and might reframe how we feel about certain things, then I think we begin to think about the past differently. And there's a funny thing about the past, as it leaves deposits, is that sometimes we don't confront those deposits. But when we don't confront those deposits come back to haunt us. And they haunt us particularly when we do not deal with them and when we do not resolve them. And therefore, what we have is an opportunity of resolution, an opportunity to tackle and grapple with these deposits, to have a set of frank conversations about slavery and its deposits and the way in which questions of racism, anti-black racism, operates not only in the United States but in Rhode Island. We tell the story, therefore, of the centrality of Rhode Island to American slavery and therefore to American history is to confront the historical ways of life that have shaped our nation and have shaped much of our thinking today. I would want to suggest to you that only when we confront that, only when we grapple with that, fiercely, honestly, soberly, only when we do that, we will be able to understand the past and to move from that past to create an inclusive future. That, I think, is the road and the future of the work that we're trying to do. Thanks very much.
Well, this young man from Georgia just learned a whole lot that he didn't know. So I think we are, obviously, as you can tell, we are having a conversation that could definitely take more than 1 hour to cover. So we hope that you didn't come here to learn all about slavery in Rhode Island, but there are other opportunities to do so, and certainly books and other people to talk to later on. But this is really just an overview, sort of an introduction that will lead us into a discussion about what's being planned for this building. And so at this time, misplaced myself. Oh, there we are. So this time I'd like to introduce, thank you, Professor Bogues. First of all, I want to introduce the Right Reverend Nicholas Knisely, Bishop of Rhode Island, to discuss the plans and explore the topic. A little further, Bishop Knisely was elected to be the 13th Bishop of Rhode Island in June of 2012, and he previously served as a priest in Delaware, Western and Eastern Pennsylvania, and as Dean of the Cathedral in Phoenix, Arizona. He's been active in a number of ministries with a particular focus in the areas of homelessness, communications, college and youth, finance, and ecumenical relations. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Bishop Knisely to the podium.
There are, as always in church, a couple of seats up front. Anyone wants to come on. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you to the Providence Preservation Society for the opportunity to talk about these plans. In some ways, my time in Rhode Island has begun and will probably continue to be parallel to the future and the ministry of St. John's Cathedral. The way we elect bishops in the Episcopal Church is they do a national search, and someone who I think is a friend still nominated me to be one of the people to be considered as Bishop of Rhode Island about a year before the actual election. A conversation happens, we begin to learn about each other, and my first real contact with the state was in February of 2012, when it was clear that the cathedral was in trouble. They had a group of about 12 of us that were the near finalists, and we had a quiet retreat together, and a lot of the conversation was about what might happen at St. John's. And I had some really interesting ideas, I thought, of ways that I wanted to change the business model and things that I wanted to do for the congregation that was here. And I shot my mouth off and thought nothing would ever come of it, because I didn't expect to come back. Well, I made it to the finalist stage and we had a walkabout. And during the walkabout, I came into the building and I had a chance to view St. John's for the very first time. And I was surprised when I arrived to find that they were putting plastic on the windows and sealing the building up because the decision had been made to suspend services. About 2 weeks after that, I was in fact elected the Bishop of Rhode Island. And between the emails congratulating me, I got about an equal number of emails saying, what are you going to do about St. John's? So right from the very beginning, this became part of our conversations as I was assembling a team of people that I would be working with, and as we started to vision what the ministry would look like here. It was clear we needed to do something. The building was closed, but in some ways the most important things that had to happen, the roof which had leaked, and you can see the signs of the leaking roof, have been managed, and that happened before the building had its services suspended. There's a new roof on the building, and there's a new boiler in the building. So in terms of water infiltration and being able to keep the place relatively stable, we have that managed. We were left with about $700,000 of money that is for the use of St. John's. But we don't have a congregation anymore because the congregation has scattered, and it's not really possible for us to reopen the building and bring a congregation in because of the decisions that were made in the closing of it. As we began to have conversations about what we might do and how we might respond to the challenge and the opportunity that St. John represented, I began to learn something about the history of this building as I was learning something about the history of Rhode Island. One of the things I learned was that the cathedral had been named the cathedral probably because the bishop didn't want to upset other people. Cathedrals in the United States of America, as far as the Episcopal Church goes, are a relatively new idea. Bishop Satterley was the one who first conceived of the idea of a national cathedral in Washington, D.C. And he began to raise money for what is now the National Cathedral on Mount St. Albans in D.C. As that process of raising that money began, other dioceses said, well, we should have cathedrals too. And you see cathedrals being named from about 1870 on, and that process has continued to this day. Not all Episcopal dioceses have cathedrals. A lot of the colonial dioceses do not. New Hampshire does not. Virginia does not. We didn't until, I think, the 1920s, when Bishop DeWolf Perry named this building to be St. John's Cathedral. He might have well chosen Grace Church downtown, or he might have well chosen All Saints Memorial Church downtown. Or perhaps he would have chosen St. Michael's in Bristol or Trinity Church in Newport. Clearly there was some kind of political decisions being made. I don't have his writings, I'm afraid. But we do have canon pastors in Bristol and in Newport and in Wickford. And speaking as a bishop who knows how these things happen, it was probably a deal that was cut. St. John's, unlike Grace and All Saints Memorial, was a church that really welcomed the immigrant community. The docks were down here for a long time. People got off the docks, and many of the immigrants to Rhode Island who came over during the Industrial Revolution would go into the cathedral building and into what was the cathedral parish house, which has been demolished, and the diocesan offices are on that site. And they would find a room, and they would work to find a job here in this new country that they had come to. Because of that, it didn't have a lot of economic power and never had a really large endowment. And it meant that it was always struggling to take care of a large building without adequate resources. We have lots of churches that don't have adequate resources for their building, but it was particularly difficult here. And it had been a challenge for the congregation that had worshiped faithfully here for decades. And I don't think we want to blame the congregation who did extraordinary and heroic ministry in this place and really struggled to keep the place open against pretty significant headwinds. It's interesting that Bishop Perry made the decision apparently with not broad consultation. And I began to learn the story of how Church of Our Savior, which had been in this neighborhood, it was a church for African American people in this part of the city, had been closed, and that community had moved into this part of the building, and then Bishop Higgins had been bothered by the fact that you had an African American congregation worshiping separately from a white congregation just down the steps, and closed Church of Our Savior and merged the two congregations. That was a decision that was received in a complicated way by the community, I am told, by people in the community. Some people welcomed it, some people have not forgotten it. It struck me in the whole history of St. John's that the decisions about this building and the community had been made by people with power, either economic power or ecclesiastical power, and never been made by consulting the community or the grassroots. One of the things that I believe passionately in is the power of the community to discern a way forward when individuals cannot see the way forward. And so I did what I believe is the right thing to do and invited not my decision-making process, but opened it up to the larger part of the diocese. And we began a series of conversations. We started talking to the former parishioners of St. John's Cathedral. We had a special listening session with the members of the African American community that had worshipped in this parish, at least the ones we could contact. They talked about their pain, and I took notes. And I was told afterwards it was the first time they'd ever had a chance to tell a bishop of Rhode Island exactly how they felt about the decisions that had been made and about the way they'd been treated. And I think there's something to be said about letting them have their voice and having a person in power hear their pain. As those conversations developed between that community, between the clergy here in the Diocese of Rhode Island, the Episcopal clergy in particular, and the wider community, as much as we could invite that process to happen, an idea began to emerge, and it is related it's related to what we are calling the tracing of the trade process. In retrospect, the first time I really knew something about Rhode Island was in 2006 at the Episcopal Church's General Convention in Columbus, Ohio, where one evening we had a special showing of a movie that was a rough cut of the tracing of the trade that some of you now have seen, I hope. If you haven't seen it, I do strongly encourage you to go out and see it. It's online. And it's a powerful movie. If what you heard about slavery in Rhode Island was news to you, there's more to this story. And it's a complicated story, and a somewhat depressing story, but there is some good news in all of that. The Episcopal Church made some resolutions and committed itself to a process of reconciliation. The Diocese of Rhode Island also did, but that process had not really moved forward. And out of those conversations, people began to ask us, would there be the possibility of taking that next step, of not just having a movie and having people who have raised our consciousness about this, but could we do something to affect reconciliation? The moment we start talking about reconciliation is the moment, I have to admit, that I got very interested. Reconciliation has been a cornerstone of my ministry as a priest and as a person in the Episcopal Church from the very beginning. I was trained as a scientist. I make my living now in a theological way. A lot of what I do day to day is the reconciliation of science and theology. As one of my priests said to me, you kind of have a shtick about that, don't you? I go around the country and I give talks about science and religion and the way that I have tried to reconcile the two. The process of reconciliation is not about making everything better and everyone agree. It is about finding a way for us to live in a complicated way that is at peace with one another but respects the differences that exist and acknowledges that we are not going to see things in the same way or ever be 100% in agreement. It is the mission of the Episcopal Church according to our prayer book. When we use the word reconciliation in the sacrament of penance, people like the Episcopal Church because they say, you're just like the Catholics, but you don't have confession. Well, we actually do. We just don't. All may, some should, none must, is our rule of thumb. So if you ever want to go see an Episcopal priest, they'll be glad to accommodate you. But you don't have to. It's the central theme of what we do in our Eucharistic celebration, which is telling the story of human history at least from the standpoint of our understanding of God's interaction with human history. It is the retelling of that story in the Eucharistic prayer that is at the core of the breaking of the bread, the fraction, which is how we believe God has effected reconciliation with us. Our willingness to be broken and open to the other is how reconciliation begins. In broader society, you may have heard of the reconciliation work that was done in South Africa following the dismantling of apartheid by the Truth and Justice Commission. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the architect of that. Archbishop Desmond Tutu visited here and preached in this pulpit at St. John's. And I think there are some obvious ways that we'd like to be in touch with Bishop Tutu and see if we might invite him back or find if there'd be some way that we could work with him and what's going on in South Africa. At its core, and I want to emphasize this because it's really important, reconciliation is not about shaming. It's not about blaming. It is about telling your truth and having your truth be heard by someone else. Part of the work of reconciliation that we envision is telling our story about how faith communities were involved in the slave trade. We were involved and profited from the slave trade, and we, to some degree, worked to end the slave trade. It's a complicated story, and we want to tell that story as part of our own work of reconciliation. The dream that we have in the Reconciliation Center, in partnership with what's going on at Brown, in partnership with, I've got a whole list here, the Tracing Center, the Diocese of Rhode Island, Jonathan Daniels' house, and we are in conversations with a number of other institutions here in the state and nationally about partnering with them and working together, would be ultimately to teach people about the reconciliation process using our own experience of needing to be reconciled with our history and with the African American community as the stepping stone. In my dream world, we would be training people to be reconcilers in a way similar to what the Mennonite Church does in training people to be mediators. And we would be able to send people out with some sort of degree or certification as trained reconcilers to be able to go into places in this country where there is a desperate need for reconciliation work, for communities to be able to hear each other's stories so that they can find a way to live together that does not constantly erupt in violence. As that vision began to come into focus, we formed working groups. Those working groups have begun to deal with the questions of what we're going to do with the physical building, what we dream of in the program, and all that with the context of what I dream of, which is to use this rather large facility. I'm always surprised. It doesn't look as big from the outside as it is on the inside. C.S. Lewis wrote a wonderful story about something like that once. It's very funny if you're into Anglican history. But to find a way that we can use certainly the lower level to be a place where we can talk about the story, a museum, to talk about how faith communities participated in that relationship. Now, that's an idea now. These conversations are ongoing and evolving. We're talking to people from the African American community here in Rhode Island, as you would well expect we have to, and we want to be sensitive and open to what they imagine and what they have as their dreams. I don't want to fall into the trap of being a person who has control of a building and telling people how they're going to use it. I do, however, have a vision that we will keep the nave, the upper floor. That will probably be changed so it can be used for multi-purpose, for various art performances, for community things, and for worship. This is still the cathedral of the Diocese of Rhode Island. We do dream that we'll have ordinations here again, that we will have worship services here again. That's part of where we'd like to go because that is, again, part of the work of reconciliation. All of that is within the larger context of cathedral ministry in the 21st century. And I'll just end by saying that the way that cathedral ministry is now being understood in North America and in Europe by the cathedral deans, and I formerly was one, so I'm reporting to you how we talk about that, is cathedral ministry is essentially a crossroads ministry. It is a ministry where the sacred meets the secular. It's a special ministry that's different than a pastoral ministry in a typical congregation. The cathedrals very intentionally have one foot in the sacred world and one foot in the secular world. A museum, an interpretation of our own secular history and religious history to people who are visiting Rhode Island, an attempt to reconcile with our own past is part of that secular work. The sacred work of worship and asking God to enliven our dream of reconciliation is part of the sacred ministry. And finding that ongoing relationship is what we dream of would be the new cathedral ministry of St. John's going into the 21st century. So what's this going to cost? It's going to cost a lot of money. But there's no point to raising money or trying to restore a building if we didn't have a vision for it, if we didn't have a mission for it. There's lots of other things and other congregations that we could be raising money to restore and to fix up. So now that I think we as a people have a vision and a mission, and we've been testing it out and having these conversations, we're hoping that we'll begin to start raising money. We have some money, not nearly enough to finish what we even imagine would be the initial stages here. And so we're starting to write to grant agencies, we're starting to widen our circle, look for allies, look for people who will open doors for us, who might share the vision we have and would help us find the kinds of resources we need. It's a complicated building built on the side of a hill with bad drainage. It has a historic cemetery which has marked graves and unmarked graves, slave graves buried in the same ground as bishops' graves. And I think there's a metaphor there and a very poignant image in that. And I see it as I walk in and out of my office on a daily basis, and it stands a challenge to me and a promise to me that somehow, in the end, we are all one people, and we all will stand together in the light. So with that and a little sermon at the end there, I'll finish. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Bishop. That was illuminating. To illuminate some more, I want to invite two others up to our panel. We'll be joined by James DeWolf Perry, Executive Director of the Tracing Center, located in Watertown, Massachusetts, and Ray Rickman of the Rhode Island Historical Society, right here in Providence. So I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And James and Ray, if you could just briefly introduce yourselves and maybe give a brief reaction to the two things you've heard already. Ray, do you need a microphone? I can take it over.
So I used to be secretary of the Rhode Island Historical Society, but I'm really here for Black Heritage tonight. Okay. I want to, both speakers are elegant and pointed, and I'm not going to comment on what they said. I'd like to comment on what I think slavery is. And I know the numbers, I know the voyages, I've been to see the papers. But what slavery is up till 1865, 75–80% of all African Americans were slaves. And then for 10 years we worked out of it. But about 65% went to be sharecroppers. And often on the same land, same plantation. And by the 1930s, 40s, they were indebted to the owner. And if you tried to leave, the sheriff would arrest you because you owed the former plantation owner $3,000–4,000. My father is an example of that. They snuck away in the night, owing $7,000 accumulated over 30 years because you didn't, make enough. So slavery did not end in 1865, nor in 1875, nor in 1845. And if you look at the lynchings of black people every year, right through 1959, you have slavery in America. Then comes Lyndon Johnson and a gift from God, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young and Rosa Parks, and I'd be here all night to name you the 7,000 or 8,000 leaders, Jewish, black, who brought apartheid down in 1964, 1965. I was born in an apartheid society, as 70–80% of you were, and you don't acknowledge it. That's our first problem. You're born in the same country that South Africa became, most of you. I think it's really cool when I meet 25-year-olds. They were not born in an apartheid society. So, when I was a child of 7, I stepped on a rusty nail on the beach in Belle Isle, in Detroit. And the nail went through my foot, and the lifeguards came and they wrapped it in everything they could wrap it in. The ambulance came and took me away. I was busy bleeding to death. And they took me to the Roman Catholic Mount Carmel Hospital, where they turned me away. No blacks could go into that hospital. This is a result of slavery. 2 years later, as a 9-year-old, it was the first time I was in federal court. I've been there 6–7 times since, but it's my first time there because my sister Ann and I had our own big yellow rolling bus. It was really cool. Just my sister Ann and I. They used to strap her up, and because she was a 7-year-old, and I could go up and down the aisles and have a very good time. Okay? We lived in an all-white neighborhood, and we could not go to the school. You listening? This is the results of slavery. And I could give you dozens, hundreds, thousands of cases like that. That's slavery. Now, when we meet again, I'd like to talk about reconciliation and what I think of it. But let me, and I think the bishop and the church is on the right path because slavery is so hard to deal with. It needs other components for a museum. My big goal in life is that one day when I'm giving a tour, a 12th grader will not say to me, "Was there slavery in Rhode Island?" My bigger goal is that a 50-year-old will not say that to me. One of the most absurd comments to come out of people's mouth, that they have been miseducated. Final comment. I always want people to know the truth and to push for change versus thinking things are normal or better. Or when I go out to do diversity training, people say, "Aren't we all equal now? What are you doing here?" Wednesday, April 8th, 2015. This is not 1915. 2015. Officer is charged with murder of a black man shot in the back. Shot with 5 bullets, shot at 8 times. Officer indicted for murder within 48 hours. Unheard of. This is how blatant, how bad this is. This is a result of slavery.
Thank you, Ray. James, would you like to say a few words?
That was an awful lot to hear, and I'm hoping for most of you at this point, the weight of this history and the need for us to talk about it and to work on reconciling from it is clear. What I'd like to do is to say just a little bit about where we go from here, what the process of reconciliation might look like, and what a Center for Reconciliation might try to do in practice. I'm really here in 2 distinct but closely connected capacities. The first, I'm the executive director of the Tracing Center, which is one of those partner organizations that Bishop Knisely mentioned. The Tracing Center is based in Boston, but we're a national organization, and our mission is to educate the public about the history and legacy of slavery and race in the United States. Our goal in particular is to combat some of those pervasive public myths that let so many Americans believe that slavery was that simple North-South story we heard about. To believe that convenient myth coming out of the Civil War, for example, that whatever connection the North might have had to slavery was minor, and that the North's major connection to slavery was emancipation, was bringing that about at the end of the Civil War. That's not an accurate picture of the country's history, but it is such a powerful one that myths like that impede our conversations about race today. So the Tracing Center's mission is to educate about this history with a specific eye towards trying to understand what we need to know differently in order to have better, fresher conversations about race today. How the public can have dialogue to bring about racial healing and reconciliation with a better awareness of our starting point, to try to bridge some of that racial divide that comes up. For example, when there's police violence involving a black man, why is it that our racial conversations on what to do can't even get past the point of understanding the nature of the problem, because so many Americans see the problem from such very different perspectives? The answer to that starts with historical understanding to give us a better understanding of racial realities today. The Tracing Center does this in part by working around the country directly with members of the public on public programs, on history and dialogue. We also work extensively with museums and historic sites on how to interpret this history for visitors of very different backgrounds, how to interpret this history with sensitivity and with balance, and that's an enormously difficult challenge. It's difficult because slavery is such a painful history, the legacy of slavery, the history of Jim Crow, so painful, but also because for so many Americans, these myths we have about history impact how we see our own families. And this is something very close to my heart because this was the story of my family. I grew up, my name is James DeWolf Perry, I'm the sixth in an unbroken line of 7 James DeWolf Perrys. That Bishop Perry, that Bishop Knisely mentioned, who made the decision to make this the Episcopal Cathedral in Rhode Island, was the 3rd James DeWolf Perry, my great-grandfather. Growing up, I heard an awful lot about our roots in New England, about participating as a family in settling New England, and bringing about New England's prosperity, fighting the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, about bishops and ministers in my family. And it was a very comforting picture until, as an adult, I learned that we were named for James DeWolf, who, as a number of you know, was the leading slave trader, not just in the history of Rhode Island, but in the history of the United States. And in the wake of that revelation, a number of us came together to make that film Bishop Knisely mentioned, Traces of the Trade. I know some of you have seen that. And in Traces of the Trade, we literally go across the triangle trade, uncovering our family's history on camera, trying to reconcile with what it means to us today as DeWolf descendants and as Americans to understand better how much this part of the country depended on slavery, and to try to draw connections between our own family's amnesia about this history and our nation's broader amnesia. New England's amnesia in particular about how important this history was, because we suddenly start to see our family's history differently. And we suddenly start to see the history of New England and of institutions like the Episcopal Church in a very different light when we understand some of what was going on during all of this history that we're not really programmed to understand. And so it's with some awareness of this history that we carry out the mission of the Tracing Center and try to find ways to incorporate new views into our conversation about race and reconciliation, to do this in particular without trying to point fingers. This isn't about blame, it's not about shame, it's not about trying to dredge up the past so that we can keep it firmly in mind as our guidepost. Rather, it's about trying to uncover this history so we're all on the same page. We can acknowledge this history together and then try to figure out how to move forward, how we can heal, how we can reconcile from a history that, as Ray Rickman explained, is very much with us every minute of every day today. Why don't I leave it at that so we can
So, but if you cannot hear, just raise your hand and I will pass the microphone so they can answer so that you can hear. But we're going to try it without a microphone for them. So you guys please speak up. We had some pre-prepared questions. I think we've touched on most of the answers to those. But I do have one I'd like to ask, and I think Bishop Knisely mentioned this to me a while back when we were talking about this, but does the work of the proposed Reconciliation Center have impacts and work beyond Rhode Island, or is this about Rhode Island only?
In my dream, yes. I mean, what I would like to see is something that starts here in Rhode Island and spreads across the country. This telling the story, the learning how to do the work of reconciliation, and what we talked about, the idea of some sort of educational program in cooperation with some of the extraordinary educational institutions that we have here in Rhode Island. But you start with who you are and you tell your story. So we begin here.
Thank you. Anyone else like to?
Yes, you know, I'm very excited that we will be across the street from the national park because people from the entire world show up there, and they will send them across the street.
And I would just say that the National Park Service has been doing a wonderful job in recent years on talking more about this history. So I know they as an institution have a great interest in connecting over this kind of history. I would just say that while it's important to tell our own story, and inevitably there'll be a lot of focus on Rhode Island's history here, it's also inevitable that it will get set in somewhat a broader context, so that this will not be about Rhode Island's burden historically, but about Rhode Island as an example of the nation's collective burden. This is not about pointing a finger at any one or any institution or any state individually, but rather about understanding a much broader history that connects to much broader national patterns.
I mean, what I want to say to that is that there's a way in which if we are able in Rhode Island to successfully both establish a museum and begin a process of reconciliation, then that has legs. In other words, there's a way in which if you can model what you are doing properly, then it actually has a set of repercussions and echoes right across the nation. Because the nation needs to understand and to have that discussion. That's what, you know, when Ray talks about, you know, the shooting of black men, which has been going on for a long time, just that it's not today much more public, you know, it's one consequence of the anti-black racism I speak about. And that to have a discussion about that is really very important. I mean, reconciliation is about, for example, us understanding why is it that somebody would look at a young black man who both of them are the same weight, virtually the same height, and say, I shot him because he hulked up at me. And he looked like he was hulking. And all it was is that you have an imaginary in your head that somehow young black men are, you know, are dangerous figures. And therefore, one of the things about trying to think through this kind of process and the Museum and Reconciliation is to confront some of our deepest imaginaries, some of the deepest ways in which we have thought about each other in this country. There's no going around that one.
Thank you, Tony. Those are that definitely answers my question. It brings to mind another question, though. And some people have said that you know, we're talking about slavery, which is the slavery in the past, but I hear that you're talking about current form, specifically racism. Would the center or would your work work on other types of issues, such as slavery that exists today, or other issues?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the center, obviously. I mean, I can only say that for us at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, we make a set of distinctions. We argue that slavery in the Americas that begins in the 1600s and formally ends in 1865 in this country, 1884 in Brazil and so on, that it is a specific kind of slavery. Ray is right that after that you have Jim Crow, you have segregation, you have what's, apartheid, and so on. And then we have what we call human trafficking, right? And some people call human trafficking slavery. We at the center kind of tend not to do that because we don't want to confuse what we think are different ways, particularly in this country where conversation has not been had fully, and to try and think about lump every form of human bondage as slavery, right? For us, precision is important, not just because we're scholars at a university, but precision is always important for any kind of analysis, I think, not just for academic analysis. And so, for us, there is racial slavery, there is human bondage and trafficking, which is very important, that any kind of center that does slavery generally or reconciliation has to take that into consideration. And then there are the after effects of racial slavery, which is anti-black racism and the way in which it's constructed, and the way in which black lives are treated in this country. And all those, in fact, are part of, if you wish, something. They are separate, but they're interconnected.
Sure. The Bishop, would you echo that as far as the work you see happening here?
I do. I think we have to keep our focus on what we're trying to do here. The question of human trafficking, which is a major issue in New England and an issue in Rhode Island as well, is something the Diocese as a broader institution is involved in. The Anglican Church, the Worldwide Anglican Communion, and the Roman Catholic Church. It's one of the places that we are working cooperatively across those two communions. The Archbishop of Canterbury and Pope Francis are focusing their work on that. I think that there's necessary connections, but I don't think we want the diocese to be limited in just doing it through the Center for Reconciliation.
Great. Would anyone else like to speak to that? Okay. Well, I think I'd like to open up the floor to questions. So, does anyone have a question for our panel? No questions? There must be.
There's probably going to be a long slog to raise the money, but you'll probably be able to do it. But beyond that, reconciliation isn't exactly a sort of sexy concept. So what's the dynamic that's going to drive this and is going to generate enough revenue to keep it going? How are you going to sustain it now?
Well, let me repeat the question. So, we have a camera though.
Okay.
I want to make sure we get the sound for the people who are watching this at home later. I want to make sure that we have the questions repeated. So the question is, how since reconciliation is perhaps not a sexy subject to raise money around, how will the diocese or the center raise money for the work?
I think that's a key question. It's not a question that's unique to St. John's or to the center. It's something we're asking ourselves in all of our congregations across the state. We have to find ways to be economically sustainable, and that's probably going to be multiple streams of income, different ways of doing things. One of the reasons I want to see a worshiping congregation here. It's one of the reasons I want to see a museum here. It's one of the reasons I want to see a center here. I would love to find people that we could rent parts of the building to that would have a mission that would be congruent with the other things that we're doing in other parts of the building. And I would love it if somebody with means decided that they wanted to make an endowment. There are people, when this story broke, I was stunned. We weren't prepared for it to get out. We just had a resolution passed at our diocesan convention, and it was written up in the newspaper. That weekend, it was carried in over 1,000 papers across the country. Ended up on the front page of the Los Angeles Times and in the editorial page, partly because the events of Ferguson were unfolding at that time. There are people of means in the West Coast that might be willing to help support and endow this, and I would be delighted to ask them for their support and help. That would be probably for the different parts of it. And there's a legal question that we're working on, the incorporation of the Center for Reconciliation as a secular 501c3 organization. The diocese will continue to own the building, and the Cathedral of St. John's hopefully will be open again in some form, whatever that will look like. But that might be a decade from now. It might be something for my successor to manage 20, 30 years from now.
Can I respond to Peter quickly? Peter, we don't normally talk about what's sexy at church, but anyway, I'm not sure your premise is correct. There are only about 10% of museums make a lot of money. And so that's a revenue stream if you can find out how to do it. But the Wright Museum in Detroit gets 50% of its income from school children. Now that's my goal, to have the yellow buses come. There are 282 schools in this state. And I would like to see every other one of them come 4th grade, 7th grade, 12th grade.
I don't
Seriously.
know that far away.
Right. And so I think you could find the revenue streams, and one of them would be that. And then finally, one of the sexiest subjects ever, and I'm a little member, I give my $50 a year, is the South African endeavor, in which a nation was moved by it and the world. So if you do it right, you can make it sexy. I think you can.
I saw another hand. Did you have a question there? Yes.
I just wanted to comment that I find the subject extraordinarily sexy. This subject ignites me, and when it's tied to the current news that we see every day, it is extraordinarily vibrant, extraordinarily moving. It sends chills up my spine, and everyone I talk to about it, it does the same to them. So I really don't think, in the long run, even though it's going to need a lot of money, it's going to come, because it's the right thing to do at the right time in this country.
And I think that is the cue to pass
It's in your prayers.
Well, I have a question for Ray, and I'll take yours. Ray, you're very involved with the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. Has there been conversation within that group or within the larger African American population of Rhode Island about this, and what is the reaction?
So I've had an extraordinarily positive day. So I think it's mixed. Let me report. I must have spoken to 50 people, one very prominent member of the community in the room. Half of them think it's a grand idea. Let's get on with it, and it's about time. And the other half think it's probably not a good idea, and it may not come out well. It may, and then we haven't got to the people who are just worried that it may be stale or whatever. That's a separate group.
Mm-hmm.
This is the issue of slavery is complex and troublesome. Often to black folks who sometimes don't want to talk about it, just like white folks. And then for black folks who want to have the discussion and think white folks aren't going to have it. And then white folks who, I won't keep going through it. But one of the things I would like to see is an educational program extraordinary beyond belief. Again, back to Detroit, they do 150 events a year. And that's what you have to do, cover the waterfront, involve people, educate people, and you have to remember everybody's on different levels. I would like, for the first time in the history of Rhode Island since I've been here, I find this one of the most segregated, bigoted places I've ever set foot. Every time I show up someplace, there are 300 white people, not a single black person, or Latino, or Asian. I went to, last comment on this, I went to a Washington Park event on how Washington Park should look. 80 white people and me in a neighborhood 65% black and brown. We have to work to do this right. And I think, and I don't know the bishop well yet, I think he's committed to it. I will be thrilled if once we have a dialogue and a project and a final project that involves African Americans fully. That's my response. I think we haven't done that yet because, to be nice, we're in the beginning stages.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Do you have a question?
I'm curious to know more about the plans for outreach. I know when you're involved in a conversation with the general public, there's school children, there's getting the conversation out to people who may not participate in sort of cultural events like this, and also about the sort of idea that when you're a nonprofit, you're reaching out to donors, and a lot of money comes from white families who have, money. So I've seen that for nonprofits. So how do you outreach to the general community and get everyone involved so that the conversation isn't dominated by wealthy?
So let me repeat the question. There are a couple of points, both regarding outreach. How will you do a really broad, inclusive outreach to reach populations that may not be easily reached, and also how much voice will donors say, especially if they're typical donors, wealthy, probably white. So I think is that the sum of the question?
I think that's a challenge. I think, however, that depending how we raise the money and in what phases we raise the money, we can do it such that we won't have any one person calling the shots. The diocese owns the building, so it's the really expensive thing is already here. We're probably going to have to do the renovations in phases, just realistically, and that'll be smaller sets of money. There are lots of different people who have lots of different agendas. There are ways that those things can fit together. I was reading the other day that the base of the Statue of Liberty was built by pennies from school children across the country. And I am aware of the power of communications and technology to allow us to have another way of raising money, which might not be one or two large donors, but might be more grassroots oriented. And I think if that were to happen, that would be a pretty good firewall against your concerns.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Yes.
What's your stance and what do you always say about failure?
Oh, well, so I should tell you. So go ahead and repeat it, and you introduce the speaker as the bishop's wife.
The bishop's wife would like to know, or I think would like for him to say publicly his stance on failure.
One of my colleagues in the House of Bishops has said that the Episcopal Church has not had enough good, grand, and glorious failures in its life. And that means we've oftentimes played it safe. We've not tried to do something new and risk failing. I've said this to the clergy in the diocese, I've said it to the lay people in the diocese, please try. The fear of not trying something in a moment in history when things are in flux, both in our nation and in the world's economy, that's the wrong strategy. At least let's try. And if we find something that doesn't work, at least we know that didn't work, and we have one less thing to try the next time. But I've been encouraging people to just try something. And part of what you're seeing here is growing out of that sense. Someone asked me on the radio a few months ago if this was my idea and why I had to say this to Rhode Islanders. And the truth is, I wish it was my idea. But it's not my idea. It's an idea that has come up from the grassroots of the people of Rhode Island. And I want to honor that. And I think there's a way we can have their voice interacting with the voice of the church and the sacred in this wonderful space.
Great. Any more questions? Okay, no more questions. I'd like to thank our panelists, our speakers tonight. As I mentioned, PPS is really a conduit for getting out information about what's going on in some of these endangered places. We've taken this place off our list because we feel that there is a plan moving forward. We look forward to learning more and seeing how it unrolls. And if you find value in these conversations that we have, please join us as a member. We hope we can provide more of these and help educate and continue advocating for these special historic places that we have in Providence. So, Thank you all for coming. Please have some more of the reception that's provided by the Diocese. See you soon.